Everything is perfect. So where did we leave off last time? Actually, I guess before I jump in, wow, there's a lot of you here today. Usually by week 4 of Intro to Methods, the room is 2/3 empty. Okay. This year's must be wildly entertaining. All right. So, any questions before I jump in on anything? Nope, you're all good? Perfect. I love that. That's the best news I've heard all day. Okay, so I guess we ended off, yes, on this slide where we were talking about our kinds of definitions, right? And you'll have to provide both of these in your major lab assignment, so they are good to keep in mind. All right, so your nominal definition, right? Nominal definition is by far the easiest to figure out because it is straightforwardly just your dictionary definition of your concept. That was more than intended. There we go. It's like the mood lighting is a little too moody. Okay. Yeah, so basically your nominal definition is just like your dictionary definition. So if you want to talk, say, in terms of nominal definition about, religiosity, is how religious a person conceives themselves to be, or how, whatever metric you want. But, there's this one. Political party identification is the party to which people most closely associate themselves with, right? So it's a very straightforward definition. I know I'm going to harp on this too much, but I want you all to get it right. The really hard one is operational. And this is the one that people have the most trouble with on the assignment. But it's the one that's like the nominal definition is less important than the operational definition. Your operational definition, and maybe it's the term definition that messes people up, I don't know. But the operational definition is basically your straightforward explanation of how you're going to do, or how you're going to measure whatever indicator it is that you want to talk about, right? So, here, for example, political party identification may be measured by asking people, do you normally think of yourself as a supporter of the Conservatives, Liberals, New Democrats, Greens, or Bloc Québécois? Okay, today I feel great support for the Bloc Québécois because they said they're going to bring down the Liberal government by Christmas. So I'm vive le Québec libre. There you go. I'll believe it when I see it, to be honest, but okay. All right, so I would put this a slightly different way, right? So if we're talking about the operational definition and you're trying to say how you're going to operationalize your variables, right? You can say something like, I will. You can be very active about this. I will make my pen work. Come on. It is worth noting I have 862 browser tabs open, 14 Word documents, 15 PowerPoint presentations. So my computer's like, what is it you want me to do at the end? Yes. I'm going to go with attention deficit disorder. I'm like doing 6 things at once at the best of times. And it's like, ooh, a thought, open new tab. Ooh, a thought. And, until we get to when my computer actually fully melts down, I will never actually close any of those things. And actually, it gets to a point where triaging the number of things you have open becomes a task in and of itself. And I ain't got time for that. Okay, let's try this again. I will, ... So I will, ask people which political party they typically support, right? Or I will ask them, questions, 10, I want to measure their loneliness. So this study will measure loneliness by administering 10 questions from the UCLA Loneliness Index, right? Whatever it is you're going to do, like however it is you're conceiving of how you will measure it, your operational definition, right, is going to be you stating how you're going to measure something in active terms, right? So you will use active language, right? Active language. That's going to be the key to having a good operational definition. You're going to tell the reader, me or L'Oreal, how you're going to measure this thing in very, very clear terms. Okay, hopefully that all makes, I know I explained this last time. I'm sorry again for repeating myself. It's one of those things that people tend to miss or get confused on in terms of operational definition, but it is critical, especially in a research proposal, to tell people how you're going to measure something. Okay, how are we doing? Sorry, I tabbed forward before letting you answer. All right, good. Okay. So, your indicators, right? An indicator basically indicates, all right, your indicators are basically your variables, right? So your indicators are going to, tell us as researchers, and when we're doing statistical analysis, it's going to be what you measure, right? So it's going to tell us, how strong someone's sort of association with a particular answer or concept is, right? So, a very typical way that we do this, and I'll talk about this when we do survey design, is you give people a statement, right? So you say, I would like to see the government of Justin Trudeau toppled in the next week, right? And then you would have options from like strongly agree to strongly disagree as part of your options, right? So that would be like, I don't know, hatred of the liberals would be the thing that you're measuring, right? That would be what that is an indicator of. So if you were wanting to measure it, let's say, likelihood of wanting the government to fall versus political party affiliation, right? You would basically then say, okay, which party do you most closely identify with? So, sorry, does that all make sense? I kind of flubbed that one as I was talking through it, but does it make sense? Okay. Yes, no? Okay, good. You gave me a blank stare, so then it was like, are you just being polite? Now I'm feeling insecure. No, I'm kidding. I just want to make sure you understand. Okay, so usually one indicator is adequate. Like, if you wanted to attitudes about the current government, you could have one kind of indicator. I would say, generally speaking, it's better to have a whole bunch of indicators that are all kind of aligned on the same topic, because it's going to give you more things to work with. Like, I know we're not doing statistical analysis in this class, but when it gets to the point, when you go on and you do advanced stats with either Phil or Michelle Morato, the more indicators you have, the more kind of fancy multivariate stuff you can do, the more, you can do a whole bunch of really, really fancy statistics. Having two things, that you're comparing is not the worst, but the more you have, the better it is, right? So you want, if you're measuring religiosity, right? You could have one measure of religiosity, right? You could say, how religious do you consider yourself to be, from very religious to not very religious? But the reason, like, if you ever look at sociology of religion research, that you have like a whole bunch of questions around belonging, behavior, and belief, is because you want multiple indicators that would give you a lot of nuance. So the more you have here, the more nuance you have. It's really hard to write when you can't see what you're writing. You get a lot more nuance in your statistical analysis, right? So you can get away with one. But let's say even, I'll put it this way, when it comes to survey writing, right? So you're gonna do a little bit of like beginner kind of work in survey writing. For the mini lab, it's 5 questions, and you have to expand that for the major lab. If you only have one indicator, your survey ends up, being really, really, really difficult to write, because you don't have a lot of points with which to kind of interrogate a particular concept. So lots of indicators of a concept are really good, right? So like I said, wish this wasn't lagging, but you've got your religiosity, having those, in belief, belonging, and behavior, and then in each of them having kind of, I missed a B. Oh, there it is. In each of them having multiple indicators within that is going to give you a really, really nuanced kind of picture of the people or groups that you're working with in terms of surveys. So more is better. Obviously, when we talk about survey research, too much more is sometimes less better, only because you don't want to ask too many questions and tire people out. But we'll talk about that when we talk about survey design, because there's a bit of an art to it, but all of which I will enlighten you of, and you'll be masters by the time you leave the class, or you'll at least have tried it once. Okay. Sorry, does that all make sense? I know, it's probably pretty simple. Basically, I just said all this. I forgot this slide was here. But actually, there's an important point, especially at the bottom. Okay, so using multiple indicators, more than one variable to measure a concept. Yeah, I mean, it gives you more nuance, right? Less likelihood of misclassifying people because of the language of a question, right? You never quite know how people are going to interpret your questions. Level of English or whatever language you're working in, people's context, maybe they're half distracted while they're doing your survey. So a few indicators will give you a better sense overall, and you can sort of like weed out questions that were misinterpreted. Yeah, I mean, generally ensures that the definition of the underlying concept is understood correctly by the people taking your survey. You get wider, more active. This is when I pack in every moment of my day I'm doing something, then my brain doesn't have time to catch up. So it gives you access to a wider range of issues related to the concept, right? So more things that you can measure, more nuance that you can get, all good, right? So you can make these really fine distinctions between groups, between age groups, all sorts of things, right? Okay, obviously I said factor analysis and cluster analysis, or more types of kind of statistical analysis. The more data you have, the richer it is, the more fun statistical nonsense you can do with it. And this one, again, we get to surveys, this is important. It will help you weed out response sets. So response sets are basically when people, rather than doing your survey, right, in a careful and nuanced way because they want to help you, they're just trying to rattle through it as fast as possible to get it done. And this can happen lots of times, right? Like if you've ever done one of those annoying customer service surveys at like Walmart because you hope in vain that you're going to win the $1,000 Walmart gift card. I've never heard of anyone actually winning a $1,000 Walmart gift card from filling out a customer survey. So I actually don't know if they actually do it. But you might just go like B, 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 right? Yeah, everything was fine. Just to sort of get through the survey. You'll have people doing that as well, and especially if, say, this is happening a lot now with online survey platforms. Like if you look through like Leger, Leger Web, Abacus Data has their own, Ipsos and Angus Reid have their own. These kind of platforms, they all offer some kind of reward, right? So basically, like, I know with Leger, because I used to do a bunch of Leger surveys to earn gift cards so I could buy a PlayStation. I eventually did. It took like about 6 months of doing 3 surveys a day to earn enough points to get a PlayStation, but I did. You would go, you go through, you do surveys, they're offering you a certain number of points for having done a survey. And if all you want is the points at the end of the day, you could just do like a response set, right? You're just filling out all the bubbles in a straight line so that you're not actually having to really, so you're not really having to read the questions and you can go through it a lot faster. Now, that if you had a bunch of people, and this is becoming a bigger problem with online because there's more like small inducements, which means there's more people who are there just for the prize at the end, not because they actually want to help you, right? They're just like, I do this as like a way of getting $10 gift cards in $10 or $20 increments. Those will screw up your whole findings, right? If you have a bunch of people that have response sets, right, that have filled it out without looking. But the more indicators you have, right, the more likely you're going to be able to see that someone just picked like neutral on everything or good on everything. And you can basically just kick that, you take that data set and you're just like, okay, this looks like a response set, kick it out, throw the data away. So the more indicators you have, the more obvious it's going to be when someone hasn't filled out your survey correctly. So, and you want to avoid that. Okay. Does that all make sense? Okay. This will now become your best friend. Your mother, your father, is now the one which I pronounce differently every time I say it. Either the Likert or the Likert scale. But I'm going to say Likert scale because I think that's correct. So Likert scales. They're basically a tool within statistical research to collect people's opinions on things. So they're very simple. And the reason that you see them a lot, right? The reason that if you do any number of surveys, you're probably going to see this kind of a set pretty often, right? Other ones that you might see are, completely satisfied to completely dissatisfied. These are kind of scales that you'll often see in a lot of surveys. So, my friend Dorothy, who writes surveys for a living, does not like them, but whatever, she's not here, so she can't argue with me. They're a really good tool, and they're a good tool for a couple of reasons. And people use them a lot because they're really simple. So, usually what you're doing is you're usually asking the respondent to give their level of agreement with a statement. The way you use something like this, right? So a strongly agree or to strongly disagree, the items have to be a statement, right? So you're generally going to put it again as some kind of statement. And see, I did this in a survey that I did in Edmonton here. So you can kind of see what's there, right? Catholic organizations that receive government funding should be allowed to provide services in a way that aligns with their faith-based values, right? So that's a statement, and then people can rate their level of agreement with that. They have to be statements. The second you throw a question, Likert scales don't always make sense because how do you completely agree with a question, right? So if you even just phrase this, should Catholic organizations that receive government funding be allowed to provide services in ways that align with their faith-based values? Question mark. Strongly agree with what? The question, right? So it doesn't make sense. And I only say this, and I say this jokingly, because when you submit your practice survey questions, some of you, probably the ones that didn't come to class today, will submit Likert scales with questions, and then I'm going to parade around the CCR reading your question and then mockingly saying somewhat agree, right? No, I'm kidding, but I will read them to myself and chuckle because, and write you a comment that's like, you can't somewhat agree with a question, right? It doesn't work. So they have to be statements, right? They have to be statements when you're using a Likert scale. Especially this strongly agree to strongly disagree level of agreement. It's a very, very simple, very, very straightforward tool. Lots of people use it because it's really simple. The other thing is people understand these scales really, really well, right? There is something to be said in survey design for scales that people don't have to think about the scale, right? One of the other things that people sometimes do is each of these points, right? So each from A to E, each of them is like 3 sentences long. And then in order to answer, whatever question you're asking, someone has to read through really complex response sets, which often leads to people quitting, right? Because they're like, I don't understand anymore. By the time I got to E, I forgot what A was, and this is just way too complex, and people will get frustrated and quit. Likert scales are really simple because you read a statement, you'll probably have a sense whether you strongly agree or strongly disagree instead of visceral level. You don't really have to think about it. And if you reuse them, from question to question, which is what most people using this kind of scale do, between questions, you're not changing scales. So people automatically already know, kind of what you've done, right? So, something I said? No, I'm kidding. 2 people walked out. All right. What was I saying? Okay, yeah, so they're really elegant, really simple, and whoever your audience is, if you're doing a survey, they're going to understand what this scale means, right? And especially if you keep it consistent from question to question. One of the biggest mistakes people make is flicking to the next slide, is changing scales every question. Honestly, I've done enough surveys to tell you, it is incredibly frustrating when people change the scale through every other question. The more consistent you are, the better completion rate you're going to have, and that's a big problem with surveys. And honestly, if you want to just see some of these in action, right? So for when you go to write your own kind of survey questions, go to something like Leger Web, right? I'll write it for you. Leger is a big polling firm. Leger Web, you can sign up and you can do some surveys and do 5, and you're gonna get a sense really quickly of what works, what's good, and what's bad. And trust me, even though Leger Web will host a bunch of marketing surveys for people who should know what they're doing, I can tell you, having done enough of these, there are a lot of really, really bad surveys out there that whoever it was that wrote this survey did not have me as a professor for intro to social methods, because they never would have made those mistakes had they been in this class. Okay, so I think, am I done ranting on this? I don't know, maybe not. Let's talk about it some more. Right, so all your responses have to relate to the same object, and that should be pretty simple, right? So you can't have strongly agree, completely satisfied, or some other things, right? So it's like this, in this case, right, when we have agree, disagree, they all have to kind of relate similarly. So you can't have 2 different ideas within your response set. So they all have to kind of work the same way. Otherwise, again, people are going to get confused. They're not going to know what to answer. I know all this probably seems obvious, but you'd be surprised at how often even professionals screw stuff like this up. Honestly, I was looking at a research institute recently, and they had published their list of questions, and I was like, man, 3 of these I think are bad questions. I would fail these in my... More time. No, what did I do? Okay. I'm glad this one beeps at me. Sometimes they just shut down, and then it's 5 minutes to turn the projector back on. Yeah, honestly, like I said, I was looking through a survey done by a research institute, and I really like this research institute in the US. And I was like, man, there's some bad questions on here, and there's some bad response sets, and I don't like them. Anyway, okay. So yeah, I think that makes sense. Okay. Is that my next slide? It is. All right. Does that all make sense? I know I've talked about this for 5 minutes, and you're like, move on. We know you love Likert scales. Get over it. Okay, unstructured data. So sometimes what you get with, it can happen in a number of circumstances, but where you would typically have it on, say, a survey, and that's probably the most likely thing, is what's called say it says other, and there's an open box on the survey, and you're invited to type in a bunch of stuff. That's what's called unstructured data, right? Because when you're asking questions like this, right, that's structured data, right? Because it's following the structure of the survey that you set up. If you say, if you walked in, just say, this is a box where you can write things. So you're asking like, is there anything else that you would like to tell us about this subject? And then people will write, a couple sentences or, their life story or, in the beginning, whatever it happens to be. People are weird and they do all sorts of interesting things in these unstructured boxes. I've never really gotten more than a couple sentences out of people, but I've certainly seen, like the survey or the surveys that are being done out of the CCR right now, they're actually sitting with people and administering the surveys. And between the questions, people will say a bunch of stuff and they're recording all of that as well. And that's unstructured data too. So the problem with unstructured data is it's unstructured and you then have to sort of give it some kind of meaning, right? So this is what you do by coding. And we'll talk about coding again when we get to interviews later in the course. Coding is basically trying to organize unstructured data into something that's a little bit more comprehensible, right? So typically, right, they're labels or titles given to themes or categories, right? So what you would be doing is taking, say, statements that people make in here or in an interview, and I don't know, let's say something stupid like their preference of breakfast cereal, and you give them an open box to write it. And you have a bunch that are like, oh, I really like this sugary stuff because it reminds me of my childhood and it makes me happy. So you would be like, you would code that statement into childhood and happiness, right? So you'd create themes around that. And other people are like, I like bran because it's healthy and makes me feel morally superior to people who don't eat bran and eat sugary cereal, right? And so you put that into the category of health and asshole. No, yeah, no, I'm sorry. Sorry, I set up that joke way too far. You probably could see that one coming a mile away. So, I got lost in the joke again. But you would code that into categories like health and moral superiority or whatever it happens to be, right? So that's kind of a basic look at what coding is. Like, it's obviously much more complicated than that, and honestly, coding is one of the parts of research I don't really enjoy. My boss is a psycho and she loves coding, but most people I think find it sort of exhausting. Okay, so your categories, when you talk about the categories you create, oh yeah, I guess anytime you're doing this, you would assign numbers to codes, which a lot of times now people are using software like in Vivo to do it, and it's just automatically going to assign your codes numbers. But in the old days, when people did this by hand, they would actually like physically assign a number to it. Back in the dinosaur years of the 1990s. Yeah, so your categories shouldn't overlap, right? So basically, there's how to explain this? You shouldn't have any ambiguity between your categories, right? Something shouldn't be able to. I guess there shouldn't be like a gray zone between them, right? So you can have statements that fit into multiple categories, but those categories themselves shouldn't overlap. So it shouldn't be like happiness and childhood memories. Both of those should be kind of separate categories, and then you wouldn't have another category that's like sugary happiness, right? Happiness should all be one category. They shouldn't overlap in major ways. Why does my phone keep yelling at me? Oh, I think my cleaning lady's leaving my house. Okay. At least in theory, the categories should be exhaustive, right? So basically, there should be no categories or no statements that aren't covered by some kind of category. So basically, it should cover every theme that was talked about in your interviews, right? Or in your surveys. Anything that showed up in here, you should have a code for. So they should exhaust the data. And yeah, there have to be clear codes on how clear rules on how codes are applied. This is especially true when you have, I just drew an arrow, I don't know why. When you have multiple people coding data, right? So let's say, like, if I'm doing a project and I'm coding my own data, and no one else is gonna look at it other than me, you're probably okay to have pretty loose rules. What you want to avoid is, say, like the big project we're working on at the CCR, where we're probably going to have 30 or 40 people coding data, right? Because the amount of data we're generating is enormous. In a situation like that, you need really clear rules so that you minimize intercoder kind of differences, right? So you have different people coding the data. You want them all to code it the same. So you have to have really clear rules as to how to code things. And this is honestly something I've never done. I've never had to create these kinds of rules around coding because I've never really been in charge of a project that was generating that much data. I've only kind of been around it, but it sounds hard and sort of miserable. Okay, does that all make sense? Questions? No? It should be in my SOC of religion class, man. They won't let me get away with anything. They're like, when you say this about Marx, you mean that? And it's very different than intro to methods where it's like, yes, can we leave yet? Sorry. I try to make it fun. Okay, so the big concern when we're talking about quantitative research is measurement validity, right? Now, there's different kinds of measurement validity, which I'll talk about in a second. But measurement validity at its core is mostly concerned with whether you're measuring what you want to measure, right? So, just thinking of an example here. If you're trying to measure, how, like, people's religiosity or people's political party affiliation, measurement validity is concerned with, when you write a question, right, or a set of questions, you have a bunch of different kind of indicators. Are those actually going to get at, say, political party affiliation, religiosity, breakfast cereal smugness, right? Like, how do you get to measuring what you actually want to measure and not actually measure something else by accident, right? So it's a big concern, obviously, in quantitative research, because if you end up measuring the wrong thing, you're not going to be, any test that you do to test your hypothesis is going to end up being problematic, right? You're not going to really be able to make any particular statements about what you wanted to because you didn't measure the right thing. So if you wanted to measure religiosity, but instead of actually measuring religiosity, you just measured how much people like to sleep in on the weekends, right? You're going to have a sort of problem, right? You're not going to actually get a good measure of how religious people are. If you didn't ask, like, do you get up on Sunday mornings to go to church, right? And it might be like, no, I actually go, in the afternoon or in the evening. But that would be a bad question because you're actually just measuring something completely different. Okay, does that make sense? All right. So we got our various kinds of measurement validity. We'll talk about them. Face validity. This is my favorite one because it's one sentence and super easy to explain. Face validity, which you're going to be asked to do in one of your assignments. Basically, you can establish face validity if at first glance your measurement appears to be valid, right? So if it seems like just on the surface, right, at the very surface level, you're getting the right thing, right? So say you're wanting to measure religiosity and you ask people about their subjective level of religiosity, right? How religious are you? On its face, right? So like just on the surface, without digging any further into it, that seems like a pretty reasonable way to measure religiosity, right? Same thing with like breakfast cereal smugness, right? If you wanted to measure breakfast cereal smugness, asking people whether they feel morally superior to others when they eat a healthier cereal, on its face, that seems like a good measure of breakfast cereal smugness. I know what my next research project is going to be now, by the way. Okay, so face validity is really the easiest one because, for the most part, you probably wouldn't have put that measure in if you didn't at least think, it measured what you thought it was going to measure. Okay, so concurrent validity, and they all get a little bit harder from here. So concurrent validity, basically, yeah, it's established if the measure correlates with some criterion thought to be relevant to the concept. Okay, so what does that mean, right? So basically, if you have, something that you would assume is relevant to a concept, right? So again, let's take religiosity because it's an easy one. Peter, magic, okay. My handwriting is bad, but rarely that bad. So a measure that you would think of, or a criterion that you would think of as relevant to the concept of religiosity might be, how often people attend religious services, right? Because obviously people probably aren't attending religious services if they aren't actually religious, right? So you would assume that there's a correlation between religious service attendance and religiosity, right? That it's a measure that sort of makes sense. If there isn't a correlation, right, the lack of a correlation, right, would bring doubt to the correctness of the measure that you're proposing, right? So if you can't, let's say once you run the data and you actually find that religious service attendance isn't a good measure of religiosity. That's a little ridiculous, but let's say amongst Buddhists, right? Say amongst Buddhists, because Buddhists actually, religious service attendance isn't an important part of being a Buddhist. So what you might say is, okay, it seems like it correlates, but it actually doesn't correlate because I have some extremely religious Buddhists that don't attend religious services, right? So it would fail that kind of correlation test, right? It's like, oh, actually, I see in Buddhists a really strong religiosity with religious service. Sorry, these are hard to explain. Am I getting this wrong? Oh, I'm doing a different one. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm going to try this again, and I'm going to use this example. Forget what I just said, because I told you a completely different concept, which I mixed up in my head. Okay. I'm sorry about that. These ones get me a little bit mixed up sometimes. Okay, let's talk about this one. Student evaluations of teachers and professional assessments. Okay, so concurrent, yeah, I should have jumped in from concurrent. Okay, if you have two measures, right? So let's say student evaluations. So I'm really sorry, forget what I just said. Student evaluations and professional assessments, right? And let's say you're talking about me. Actually, let's talk about someone else. A different professor in the department will say, I don't know who. Professor I don't know who, right? And in Professor I don't know who's student evaluations, they got a 3.4. And on their professional assessment, right, so they have, or actually, here, let's do a different one. Rate my professor. Rate my prof. Right? Rate my prof, that should be an R. I want to rate my prof, they have a 3.6. Okay, so let's say we think that our rate my prof is a good measure of teaching ability of Professor I don't know who. Basically, if this one and this one kind of are correlated, right, they sort of match, then we can say that we have a concurrent validity because we have two different things. And I guess with concurrent validity, think two or more things measured that come to roughly similar kind of conclusions, right? So even like, let's say we'll go back to religiosity. If we have, say, religious service attendance and subjective importance of religiosity, and those two things kind of go together, right? The more someone attends religious services, the more subjectively religious they consider themselves to be, you would have concurrent validity, right? Because two measures are basically showing you the same thing, and therefore you can say that they work together, right? So there's a link between them. Okay, I know I screwed that up to start with because I got mixed up in my head. Does that make sense? Okay, so yeah, if two things kind of work together, like obviously it wouldn't make sense like if the student evaluations were like let's say a 5, and rate my prof is a 2.5. Then obviously we would say, okay, there's something wrong with one of these measurements, right? Rate my professor measures how much students like a professor. Student evaluations might be measuring something else, right? So, it might be, this is like quality of instruction. This is how personable the professor is. So you wouldn't have concurrent validity because obviously they're not moving together. Okay. All right. So, construct validity. This is all about internal consistency. How am I doing for time, by the way? Oh, wow, 6 whole minutes. Construct validity is basically like internal to your project, right? So establish if concepts relate to each other in a way that's consistent within the researcher's theory. So you would say that you have construct validity if basically you can make an argument justifying why you think these two are connected, right? So you think that student evaluations and rate my prof are related, because, right? Because they both measure students' perceptions of the classes that they took, right? Or how much they like professors, or whatever it happens to be, right? Religiosity, within my theory is that obviously more frequent religious service attendance means greater religiosity. That's my theory. That's what I'm going to be testing with a bunch of different things. So within the construct of my own theory, those things make sense and they're related in a way that sort of is consistent. So you would confirm this, by seeing that the results match what you predict by the theory. So again, this is like a deductive process. You come up with a theory, you say, I think that, cutting people off in traffic is related to, how smug you are about the breakfast cereal you eat, because both of those things are a measure of being a jerk. And then you go and you test it. I don't know how you would test that. And if it's confirmed that there's a correlation between the two, then you can say, okay, not only did I conceive of this, but in the testing, it shows that I have a construct validity. I guess the downfall with this one is that you have to have data in order to sort of make the case that you had that construct validity. All right, and the last one, convergent validity, is established if the measure of a concept correlates with a second measure of that concept that uses a different measurement technique, right? Okay, so this one is a little bit harder in the sense that like figuring this out and actually implementing this is going to be difficult. But okay, let's say we go back to our student, like what students think of professors. So let's say you want to do this quantitatively. And you wanted to find out what students think of a professor, right? So you would have your student evaluations that use one measurement technique, let's say a survey. And then let's say you would go and troll Reddit. And you would find all the mentions of Professor X, and you would classify those, quantitatively with like, you're doing essentially textual analysis. And it's like, okay, every time, this professor was mentioned on Reddit, it was, either positive, negative, what kind of comments were students making? And so you would say then, okay, you have two different things measuring. So this would be like positive comments. This would be surveys. This is textual analysis. If those two things are showing you essentially the same thing, right? They're very different measurement tools, but you think they're measuring the same concept, then you could say that you have convergent validity, right? Because you're basically measuring the same concept, but using different kind of techniques altogether. Okay, does that make sense before I leave it? Yes? Yes, it doesn't make sense?
No.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. I said, does it make sense? And you just stared forward. So I just wanted to make sure you understood. Okay, I didn't mean to embarrass you. I'm sorry. Okay, I think I'm out of, well, I'm going to say I'm out of time. I got 2 minutes. But we'll talk about measurement validity some more next time. I'll explain it to you with a fun target-themed object. Okay. All right, we'll see you on Friday. This goes on and on and on. I blame myself. Have a good day.